Marcus Williams stood outside the grand auditorium, straightening his marine dress blue uniform one final time. The morning sun gleamed off his polished brass buttons and ribbons that told stories of 3 tours overseas. Today was different from any mission he had ever faced. Today, his son David was graduating from high school, and nothing would keep him from being there. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families filled the seats. Parents clutched cameras and tissues, grandparents beamed with pride, and younger siblings squirmed in their best clothes. Marcus found an empty seat in the middle section, close enough to see David clearly when his name was called. He had driven 12 hours straight from his base to make it here on time. As Marcus settled into his seat, he noticed 2 security guards approaching him. They were large men with stern expressions, wearing the standard uniform of the private security company hired for the event. The first guard, a heavy-set man with graying hair, stopped directly in front of Marcus. "Excuse me, sir, but you're going to have to move," the guard said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that Marcus recognized from his military days. Marcus looked up, confused. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" "This seat wasn't reserved when I sat down." The second guard, younger but equally imposing, crossed his arms. "This section is reserved for VIP families only. You'll need to find somewhere else to sit." Marcus glanced around the section. The seats nearby were occupied by other parents, none of whom appeared to be wearing any special badges or identification that would mark them as VIPs. He noticed that he was one of only 3 black families in the immediate area, and an uncomfortable feeling began to settle in his stomach. "I checked with the ushers when I came in," Marcus replied calmly, keeping his voice steady despite his growing irritation. "They didn't mention anything about this section being reserved. My son, David Williams, is graduating today, and I'd like to stay here where I can see him." The first guard's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. You need to move to the back of the auditorium. Those are the rules." Marcus felt the eyes of nearby families turning toward the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed curious about the developing situation. He could see David in the lineup of graduates near the stage, and his heart ached at the thought that his son might witness this confrontation. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines," Marcus said quietly, hoping to diffuse the situation. "I just want to watch my son graduate. I'm not causing any trouble here." The second guard stepped closer, his hand moving to the radio clipped to his belt. "Your military service doesn't give you special privileges here. Now move along before we have to escort you out." The word escort hung in the air like a threat. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but his military training kicked in. He knew how to stay calm under pressure, how to assess a situation before reacting. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt like one nonetheless. An elderly woman sitting 2 seats away spoke up. "Excuse me, officers, but this gentleman isn't bothering anyone. Why does he need to move?" The first guard turned to her with barely concealed impatience. "Ma'am, this is a security matter. Please stay out of it." "Ma'am, ma'am, ma'am." Marcus stood slowly, his 6-foot frame drawing him to his full height. Even sitting, he had been an imposing figure. But standing, he commanded attention. The ribbons on his chest caught the light, each one representing months of service in dangerous places far from home. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had led soldiers into combat. "But I'm not moving either. I have every right to be here, and I'm going to watch my son graduate." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Other parents had stopped their conversations and were watching the confrontation unfold. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was happening. The first guard reached for his radio. "We're going to need backup in Section B. We have an uncooperative individual who refuses to comply with security directives." Marcus remained standing, his hands at his sides, showing no signs of aggression but making it clear he wasn't backing down. He thought about David, who had worked so hard to reach this moment. He thought about all the nights he had missed reading bedtime stories because he was deployed, all the soccer games he had watched on grainy video calls from halfway around the world. This was his chance to be present for one of the most important days in his son's life. The radio crackled to life. Copy that. Additional units en route. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. He had faced insurgents and roadside bombs, had made life and death decisions in the heat of combat. But this felt different. This felt personal in a way that military service had never prepared him for. The auditorium continued to fill as the ceremony's start time approached. The graduates were taking their positions, and Marcus could see David scanning the crowd, looking for his father. When their eyes met, David smiled and waved, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the audience. Marcus waved back, his heart swelling with pride. David had overcome so much to get here. When Marcus had been deployed, David had struggled with his grades and gotten into some trouble at school. But he had turned things around, earned a scholarship to college, and was graduating with honors. Nothing was going to take this moment away from them. The second guard spoke into his radio again. Subject is a military veteran, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dress blues. He's refusing to relocate, and is drawing attention from other attendees. Marcus heard the words but kept his focus on David. The boy had grown into a fine young man, despite the challenges of having a father who was often absent on military duty. Marcus had missed birthdays and holidays, school plays, and parent-teacher conferences. Today was his chance to be the father he had always wanted to be. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching made Marcus turn. 2 more security guards were making their way through the crowd, their expressions serious and professional. The situation was escalating quickly, and Marcus knew he had to make a decision. He could leave quietly and watch from the back, avoiding a scene that might embarrass David, or he could stand his ground and fight for his right to be there. As the additional guards reached his row, Marcus made his choice. He would stay. He would watch his son graduate from right here, regardless of what these men thought they could do to stop him. The first guard gestured to his colleagues. This gentleman needs to be relocated to the general seating area. He's refusing to cooperate with our directives. Marcus looked each man in the eye, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly but firmly. My son is graduating today, and I'm going to be here to see it. The standoff had begun, and everyone in the immediate area was watching to see how it would unfold. The ceremony was about to start, and the tension in the room was rising with each passing second. Marcus stood his ground, ready for whatever came next, determined to be there for the son who meant everything to him. Number Story. Part 2. The confrontation escalates. The 4 security guards now formed a semicircle around Marcus, their body language clearly indicating they meant business. The lead guard, whose name tag read Johnson, stepped forward with his hand resting on his radio. Sir, this is your final warning, Johnson said, his voice rising enough that nearby families could hear every word. Either you move to the designated seating area voluntarily, or we will remove you from the premises. 45. 1. Marcus remained motionless, his eyes fixed on David, who was now looking concerned from his position with the other graduates. The young man had noticed the commotion and was trying to see what was happening. Marcus gave him a reassuring nod, hoping to keep his son focused on the ceremony rather than the drama unfolding in the audience. I paid for a ticket like everyone else, Marcus replied, keeping his voice level and professional. I went through the same security checkpoint, and I'm sitting in an unreserved seat. I'm not breaking any rules or causing any disturbance. An older gentleman sitting nearby stood up, his own military bearing evident. Excuse me, but what exactly is this young man doing wrong? I don't see any reserved signs, and he's been nothing but polite. Johnson turned to the man with visible irritation. Sir, please sit down. This doesn't concern you. The older man, whose gray hair and straight posture suggested military service, didn't budge. Actually, it does concern me. I'm Colonel James Patterson, retired Army, and I'd like to know what rule this Marine has violated. The interaction was drawing more attention now. Parents throughout the section were turning to watch, and several people had their phones out, recording the confrontation. The energy in the auditorium was shifting from celebration to tension. Johnson's jaw tightened. Colonel or not, this is a private security matter. We have our orders, and this individual needs to be relocated. Orders from whom? Colonel Patterson pressed. And based on what policy? I've been to dozens of these ceremonies, and I've never seen anyone removed from unreserved seating. Marcus felt a wave of gratitude toward the stranger who was willing to speak up. In his years of military service, he had learned the value of soldiers looking out for each other. But he hadn't expected that solidarity to extend to a civilian graduation ceremony. The youngest of the security guards leaned toward Johnson and whispered something. Johnson nodded and spoke into his radio again. We need the supervisor down here immediately. We have multiple individuals refusing to cooperate. A woman sitting across the aisle spoke up. I'm recording this entire incident on my phone. I think people should know what's happening here. Her voice carried clearly through the section, and several other parents nodded in agreement. Johnson's face reddened. Ma'am, please, put your phone away. Photography and recording are prohibited during the ceremony. The ceremony hasn't started yet, she replied firmly. And last I checked, this was still America, where people have rights. Marcus could see that the situation was spiraling beyond what any of them had intended. He had simply wanted to watch his son graduate, and now he was at the center of an incident that was disrupting what should have been a joyful celebration for all the families present. The lead guard's radio crackled. Supervisor Wilson is en route. ETA. 2 minutes. Marcus looked toward the stage where the principal and other school officials were preparing for the ceremony. Some of them had noticed the disturbance and were having quiet conversations among themselves. He worried that the incident might delay or disrupt David's graduation, which was the last thing he wanted. Colonel Patterson pulled out his own phone. I'm calling the school district's main office. This is harassment, plain and simple. Johnson stepped toward the colonel aggressively. Sir. The retired colonel looked at the guard with the kind of steely gaze that had probably intimidated countless young soldiers over the years. Son, I outrank you in every way that matters. You'd better take a step back and reconsider your approach. The tension was becoming unbearable. Marcus could feel the eyes of hundreds of people on their section, and he knew that David must be mortified. He had wanted this day to be perfect for his son. Not a public spectacle that would overshadow the achievement they were there to celebrate. A new voice cut through the tension. What seems to be the problem here? Everyone turned to see Supervisor Wilson approaching, a woman in her 40s wearing a suit and carrying herself with professional authority. Her expression was serious as she surveyed the scene. Johnson straightened up. We have an individual who refuses to relocate from the VIP section despite multiple requests. The situation has escalated, with other attendees interfering with our security protocols. Wilson looked around the section, taking note of the families who were watching intently. I don't see any VIP signs or markers in this area. What makes this section restricted? Johnson hesitated, glancing at his fellow guards. Those were our instructions from the venue management. Whose instructions specifically? Wilson pressed. I'll need to see the documentation for any seating restrictions. The pause that followed was telling. Johnson fumbled with his radio, but Wilson held up a hand to stop him. Let me see your assignment sheet for today's event. Marcus watched as Johnson reluctantly pulled out a folded paper from his pocket. Wilson examined it carefully, her expression growing more concerned with each passing second. This assignment sheet makes no mention of restricted seating areas, Wilson said, her voice carrying clearly through the section. It only references standard security protocols for crowd control and emergency procedures. Colonel Patterson nodded approvingly. Then perhaps these gentlemen can explain why they've been harassing a decorated Marine veteran for sitting in an unreserved seat. Wilson looked at Marcus for the first time, taking in his dress uniform and military bearing. Sir, I apologize for any confusion. There appears to have been a misunderstanding about the seating arrangements. Marcus nodded politely. I appreciate that, ma'am. I just want to watch my son graduate without any more disruption. Johnson's face had gone from red to pale as he realized the implications of the situation. We were acting on what we understood to be clear instructions about maintaining order in this section. Wilson's expression hardened. Maintaining order doesn't involve removing paying attendees from unreserved seats without proper justification. I think you four need to return to your assigned positions and allow this gentleman to enjoy his son's graduation. The four guards exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly reluctant to simply walk away from the confrontation they had initiated. Johnson made one last attempt to save face. We were just doing our jobs, ma'am. Sometimes these situations require firm action. Colonel Patterson stood up straighter, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military leadership. Your job is to provide security, not to harass veterans and their families. I suggest you move along before this becomes an even bigger problem. The woman with the phone spoke up again. I've got this entire incident recorded. The school board and the media might be very interested in seeing how veterans are treated at graduation ceremonies. Marcus could see that David was becoming increasingly agitated, trying to get a better view of what was happening in the audience. Other graduates near him were also looking toward the disturbance, and the entire ceremony was at risk of being overshadowed by the confrontation. Wilson made a decisive gesture toward the guards. This incident is over. Return to your posts immediately. Mr. Williams, Marcus supplied. Mr. Williams, please accept my apologies for this inappropriate treatment. I hope the rest of the ceremony proceeds without any further issues. As the guards reluctantly began to disperse, Johnson leaned close to Wilson and whispered something that made her expression darken further. She nodded curtly and then addressed the section at large. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. The ceremony will begin in just a few minutes, and I want to ensure that everyone can focus on celebrating these remarkable young people and their achievements. Marcus finally sat back down, feeling the adrenaline begin to fade as the immediate threat passed. Colonel Patterson extended his hand with a smile. James Patterson, it was an honor to stand with you, Marine. Marcus Williams, thank you, sir. I couldn't have handled that alone. As the two men shook hands, Marcus realized that while the immediate crisis had passed, something had fundamentally changed in the room. The other families in their section were looking at him with a mixture of respect and sympathy, and he could feel that the incident had created an undercurrent of tension that would be difficult to shake. The ceremony was about to begin, but Marcus couldn't escape the feeling that the confrontation wasn't truly over. There was something in the way the guards had retreated that suggested they weren't entirely satisfied with the outcome, and Wilson's expression after her whispered conversation with Johnson indicated that there might be more to this situation than a simple misunderstanding about seating arrangements. Story, Part 3, The Unexpected. Allies. The auditorium had settled into an uneasy calm as the ceremony finally began. The principal took the stage and welcomed everyone to the graduation, but Marcus could still feel the lingering tension from the earlier confrontation. He tried to focus on David, who had found him in the crowd and given him a thumbs up, but something felt wrong. The four security guards had repositioned themselves around the auditorium's perimeter, and Marcus noticed that Johnson kept glancing in his direction. About 20 minutes into the ceremony, as the valedictorian was delivering her speech, Marcus became aware of movement near the back of the auditorium. 6 men in dress uniforms were making their way down the center aisle, moving with the precise, measured steps that marked them as military personnel. As they drew closer, Marcus could see the distinctive insignia and tridents that identified them as Navy SEALs. The SEALs moved with quiet efficiency, their presence commanding attention without creating a disturbance. They were clearly looking for specific seats, but their movement through the auditorium was drawing curious glances from other attendees. Marcus wondered if one of their own was graduating today. As the 6 men reached the middle section where Marcus was sitting, the lead SEAL, a tall man with graying temples and the bearing of senior enlisted personnel, made eye contact with Marcus. There was a moment of recognition between two warriors who had served in different branches but understood the same code of honor and sacrifice. The SEAL approached Marcus's row and spoke quietly. "Excuse me, Marine. Mind if we join you? We heard there was some trouble earlier, and we wanted to make sure everything was settled." Marcus was surprised but gestured to the empty seats nearby. "Of course. I'm Marcus Williams. My son David is graduating today." "Senior Chief Petty Officer Mike Reynolds," the SEAL replied, extending his hand. "These are my teammates. We're here for Tommy Harrison's graduation." He nodded toward a young man in the graduate lineup who bore a strong resemblance to him. As the 6 SEALs took their seats around Marcus, he noticed an immediate change in the atmosphere. The security guards who had been watching him closely suddenly seemed less interested in his section. Johnson, in particular, had moved to a position where he could no longer see Marcus directly. Colonel Patterson leaned over and whispered, "Looks like you've got some serious backup now, son." Senior Chief Reynolds had positioned himself directly next to Marcus, and the other 5 SEALs had arranged themselves strategically throughout the nearby rows. Their presence was subtle but unmistakable, and Marcus realized that word of the earlier incident had somehow reached them. "How did you know what happened?" Marcus asked quietly during a lull in the ceremony. Reynolds smiled grimly. "Military community is smaller than people think. Colonel Patterson there called a buddy of his, who knows our commanding officer. We were already planning to attend. But when we heard how you were treated, we decided to make sure there weren't any more problems." The ceremony continued with the presentation of academic awards and scholarships. When David's name was called for a scholarship in engineering, Marcus stood to applaud, and every one of the SEALs stood with him. The sustained applause from their section was noticeable, and David's face lit up with pride and surprise at the show of support. About halfway through the ceremony, Marcus noticed Johnson speaking urgently into his radio again. The security guard's body language suggested he was agitated about something, and Marcus caught him stealing glances toward their section. Whatever Johnson was discussing, it seemed to involve the presence of the SEALs. Senior Chief Reynolds noticed the same thing. "Looks like our friend over there isn't happy about the change in dynamics. Some people don't know when to let things go." The situation reached a turning point when Johnson and 2 other guards began moving toward their section again. This time, however, they weren't approaching with the same aggressive confidence they had shown earlier. The presence of 6 Navy SEALs had clearly altered their calculations about how to handle the situation. Johnson stopped several rows away and called out, "Excuse me, but we need to check everyone's tickets in this section. There have been reports of people sitting in seats they didn't pay for." The auditorium fell silent as nearby families turned to see what was happening now. The principal paused in the middle of introducing the next award winner, and hundreds of eyes focused on the developing confrontation. Senior Chief Reynolds stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he reached his full height, he seemed to fill the space around him with an aura of quiet authority that made Johnson take an involuntary step backward. "Is there a problem, officer?" Reynolds asked, his voice carrying clearly through the silent auditorium. The question was polite, but there was an undertone that suggested Johnson should think very carefully before answering. Johnson's confidence, which had been shaken earlier, now seemed to evaporate entirely. "We're just conducting routine checks, sir. Making sure everyone is in their correct seats." The second SEAL, a powerfully built man with the weathered face of someone who had seen combat, stood up as well. "That's interesting. We've been sitting here for 30 minutes, and you haven't checked anyone else's tickets." A third SEAL joined them, then a fourth, until all 6 men were standing. They weren't being aggressive or threatening, but their collective presence was overwhelming. These were men who had conducted operations in the world's most dangerous places, and their calm confidence in the face of conflict was evident to everyone watching. Johnson looked around desperately for support from his supervisor, but Wilson was nowhere to be seen. The other security guards seemed reluctant to get involved in what was clearly becoming a losing proposition. Colonel Patterson decided to add his voice to the mix. "Officer Johnson, I believe you already established that there are no reserved seats in this section. Are you now suggesting that this Marine and these Navy SEALs are somehow sitting in the wrong place? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus realized that the entire incident had evolved beyond a simple seating dispute into something much more significant. This was about respect, about how veterans were treated, and about the right of military families to participate fully in civilian life without harassment. The principal, recognizing that the ceremony was being disrupted again, made a decision. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a brief intermission while we resolve this seating matter. Graduates, please remain in your positions. Johnson's radio crackled, and Marcus could hear a voice saying, "Stand down immediately. Return to perimeter positions. Do not engage further." The security guard's face went through a series of expressions as he realized that someone higher up the chain of command had intervened. He looked at the 6 SEALs, then at Marcus, then at the hundreds of people watching him, and finally nodded reluctantly. "False alarm," Johnson mumbled. "Everyone can return to enjoying the ceremony." As Johnson and his team retreated, Senior Chief Reynolds remained standing. "Actually, I think there's something that needs to be said here." The auditorium was completely quiet now, with everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Reynolds looked around at the families, at the graduates, and finally, at Marcus. This Marine served 3 tours in Afghanistan, defending the freedoms that we all enjoy today. His son is graduating with honors and has earned a scholarship to college. There's no reason on earth why he or any veteran should be harassed for attending their child's graduation ceremony. The SEAL's words carried through the auditorium's sound system as someone had activated an open microphone. His voice was clear and strong, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about service and sacrifice. Military families sacrifice more than most people realize. Deployments, missed birthdays, holidays spent in combat zones. When we get the chance to be here for the important moments, to be present for our children's achievements, that's sacred time. Nobody has the right to take that away. Spontaneous applause began in their section and spread throughout the auditorium. Parents and grandparents, who had been silent observers during the confrontation, now voiced their support. Even some of the graduates joined in, including David, who was beaming with pride at his father. Senior Chief Reynolds nodded to his teammates, and they all sat down in unison. The principal returned to the podium and announced that the ceremony would continue, but the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. What had started as an incident of harassment had become a moment of recognition and respect for military service and sacrifice. As David's name was finally called to receive his diploma, Marcus stood with tears in his eyes. The 6 SEALs rose with him, as did Colonel Patterson and dozens of other families throughout the auditorium. The applause was thunderous, not just for David's achievement, but for everything the moment represented. Walking across that stage, David looked directly at his father and saluted. It was a gesture that spoke to everything they had been through together. All the challenges of military life, and the pride they shared in service to their country. When the ceremony concluded and families began to find each other in the crowd, Senior Chief Reynolds approached Marcus one final time. "It was an honor to serve alongside you today, Marine. Semper Fi. Juan. Huya, Senior Chief. Thank you for having my back." As the 2 men shook hands, David ran up and embraced his father. "Dad, what happened earlier? Who were those guys who stood up with you?" Marcus looked at his son, then at the SEALs who were gathering their own families, then at Colonel Patterson who was walking over to introduce himself to David. "Those were just some fellow service members who understand what it means to look out for each other," Marcus replied. "Today you learned something important about military families, son. We never leave a man behind, even at a graduation ceremony. They're fam. They're a lime maybe example. Marcus lime see on." The crowd began to disperse, but the impact of the day's events would linger long after the last family left the auditorium. Videos of Senior Chief Reynolds' speech would be shared thousands of times on social media, sparking conversations about how veterans should be treated and the sacrifices military families make. For Marcus, the day had started with the simple goal of watching his son graduate. It ended with a profound reminder of the bonds that connect those who serve and the communities that support them. As he and David walked toward the parking lot, surrounded by new friends and allies, Marcus realized that some battles are worth fighting, and some victories are sweeter than others.